October 14th, 1962, 10:22 a.m. Eastern Time. High above western Cuba, at more than 72,000 feet, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft cut silently through the stratosphere. Inside the narrow cockpit, Major Richard Heiser sat motionless, the thin air pressing against the aircraft's long wings as they flexed slightly in flight. From this height, the island below looked calm. Farmland, dirt roads, small villages, beginning another ordinary day. Nothing suggested danger. Then the camera began to fire. Frame after frame, the lens captured shapes that did not belong in those fields. Long cylindrical objects, rectangular launch pads, support vehicles positioned with deliberate military precision. Heiser did not speak. He did not need to. Every pilot trained for these missions knew what Soviet missile installations looked like. And these were unmistakable. 3 days later, inside a secure room at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, intelligence analysts gathered around illuminated light tables. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Cigarette smoke drifted near the ceiling. No one joked. No one speculated aloud. The photographs lay exposed, their meaning unavoidable. Finally, one analyst broke the silence. Those aren't defensive weapons. He was right. The images showed R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles, SS-4 Sandal in NATO terminology, nuclear-capable, with a range of more than 1,000 miles. From Cuba, they could strike Washington, New York, Chicago, and key strategic air command bases across the southeastern United States. They were 90 miles from Florida. What made the moment so chilling was not only what the photographs revealed, but what they confirmed. For months, a small number of analysts had warned that the Soviet Union might be preparing to deploy offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Those warnings had been quietly downplayed. Through the spring and summer of 1962, reports had trickled in. Defectors describing unusual construction, aerial sightings of massive crates unloaded at night, and Soviet technicians arriving in growing numbers at Cuban ports. One intelligence analyst circulated assessments suggesting Moscow might be willing to cross a line it had never crossed before, placing nuclear missiles in the Western Hemisphere. Few believed it. Inside Washington, the prevailing assumption was dangerously reassuring. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would not dare provoke the United States so directly. Not after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Not with weapons that could trigger nuclear war within minutes. The risk seemed too high. The consequences too severe. Within the CIA, debate simmered. Some argued the Soviets were deploying only surface-to-air missiles, defensive systems intended to protect Cuba from another American-backed invasion. It was an explanation that fit the political mood and avoided panic. Others disagreed. The layout of the construction sites, the scale of the logistics, the nature of the equipment. It did not look defensive. But in the summer of 1962, the burden of proof rested on those making the most dangerous claim. And without photographs, their warnings carried little weight. That changed with the U-2 flight over western Cuba. When the images reached senior officials, the argument ended. The missiles were real. The launch sites were already under construction, and the United States had been caught off guard. On the morning of October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was briefed inside the White House. As the photographs were explained, the room fell into a heavy silence. Kennedy leaned forward, listening intently, his expression tightening as the implications became clear. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, operational within weeks. This was no longer a political embarrassment. It was a strategic nightmare. For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, the United States faced the possibility of a short-warning nuclear strike. Missiles so close that they could reach American cities before early warning systems could reliably detect them. The delicate balance of nuclear deterrence had been shattered. Unspoken in the room was a single, haunting truth. Someone had warned this might happen. Outside the White House, Washington continued as usual. Traffic moved through the streets, offices filled with conversation. Lunch was served. There were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no hint to the public that the world had just shifted. But behind closed doors, the United States had stepped into the most dangerous 13 days in human history. And across the ocean, in Moscow, Soviet leaders waited, unaware that their greatest gamble had finally been exposed. The clock had started. The clock had started. Inside the White House, time no longer moved normally. Meetings blurred into one another, hours collapsed into minutes, and every decision carried the weight of millions of lives. President John F. Kennedy ordered the formation of a small, secret advisory group, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, as it came to be known, met in rooms sealed from the outside world, curtains drawn, guards posted, conversations kept deliberately off the record. The question was simple. The answers were not. Airstrikes, a full-scale invasion, diplomatic pressure, or doing nothing, and hoping the missiles would never be launched. Each option carried consequences that no one in the room could fully control. Across the table, military leaders argued forcefully. Airstrikes could eliminate the missile sites before they became operational. The invasion plans were already on paper. Tens of thousands of troops, landing beaches, timelines measured in hours. To them, delay was dangerous. Every day allowed the Soviets to move closer to readiness, but Kennedy hesitated. He remembered April 1961, the Bay of Pigs, the cost of acting too quickly, and he understood something else. An attack on Cuba would almost certainly mean war with the Soviet Union. Not later, not eventually, immediately. Thousands of miles away, in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev waited. To the Soviet premier, the missiles in Cuba were not an act of madness. They were an answer. The United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, aimed directly at the Soviet heartland. American bombers patrolled the skies daily. U.S. naval power ringed the globe. Cuba, newly allied and dangerously exposed, was Khrushchev's chance to restore balance. But now, that balance was unraveling. On October 22nd, President Kennedy addressed the nation. Television cameras rolled as he looked directly into the lens, his voice calm, controlled, deliberate. For the first time, the American public learned the truth. Soviet nuclear missiles had been discovered in Cuba. The United States would impose a naval quarantine around the island. No offensive weapons would be allowed through. It was a blockade, without using the word, and it was an ultimatum. That night, families across America sat silently in living rooms, radios turned up, televisions glowing softly. In cities and small towns alike, the same thought settled in. This could be the end. Fallout shelters were cleaned out. School drills suddenly felt real. The abstract fear of nuclear war became personal. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy ships moved into position. Gray hulls cut through the Atlantic, radar spinning, sonar active. Soviet cargo vessels steamed toward the quarantine line, their intentions unknown. Each blip on a radar screen carried the potential to ignite a war no one could stop. On October 24th, the world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the line. American destroyers waited. Orders were clear. Stop the ships. Inspect the cargo. Do not fire unless fired upon. At the last moment, several Soviet vessels slowed, then turned back. The immediate crisis eased, but only slightly, because the missiles were already there. U-2 flights continued over Cuba, and the photographs grew worse by the day. Launch sites nearing completion, missile erectors upright, fueling equipment in place. Time was slipping away. Then, on October 27th, the most dangerous day of them all, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed instantly. The pressure inside the White House spiked. Many believed this was the moment when restraint would collapse. Kennedy refused to retaliate. He understood something fragile still existed, a narrow path back from the edge. Behind the scenes, messages crossed the Atlantic at frantic speed. Khrushchev sent letters, first conciliatory, then defiant. Remove the missiles in Turkey, he suggested. Publicly promised not to invade Cuba. Privately, tensions escalated to levels unseen since 1945. And beneath the ocean, unseen and unheard, Soviet submarines stalked the blockade line, one of them carrying a nuclear torpedo, its crew exhausted, cut off, unsure whether war had already begun. The world survived that moment by chance. Finally, on October 28th, the message arrived. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The United States would pledge not to invade the island. Secretly, American missiles would later be removed from Turkey. The crisis was over. The war did not come. But nothing returned to normal. The Cuban Missile Crisis left scars that never fully healed. It exposed how close the world had come to annihilation, not through malice alone, but through assumption, miscalculation, and ignored warnings. One man had been dismissed. One analysis set aside. One truth recognized too late. And for 13 days in October 1962, humanity learned how thin the line between peace and extinction truly was. The war did not come. There were no mushroom clouds over American cities. No emergency broadcasts cutting through the air. No final orders transmitted from bunkers beneath concrete and steel. And yet, nothing returned to normal. When the missiles were dismantled and shipped back across the Atlantic, the world exhaled. But it did not relax. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without a single nuclear weapon being used. But it left behind something far more unsettling. Proof that civilization had come terrifyingly close to erasing itself, not because of hatred, not because of madness, but because of assumptions. For years afterward, officials would debate how close the world truly came to nuclear war. Some would argue restraint prevailed, others would credit diplomacy. But buried in reports and declassified documents was a quieter truth. This crisis unfolded not as a controlled confrontation, but as a cascade of near misses. Warnings were dismissed. Signals were misread. Time ran out faster than anyone expected. One analyst had raised concerns too early. One assessment had seemed too extreme. One truth had arrived before leaders were ready to hear it, and when it finally could no longer be ignored, the margin for error had nearly vanished. The Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped the Cold War. Hotlines were installed. Arms control talks resumed. Leaders on both sides began to understand that nuclear deterrence was not a stable balance. It was a fragile illusion, held together by human judgment under unimaginable pressure. The lesson was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. The most dangerous moments are not the ones we see coming. They are the ones we explain away. In October 1962, humanity survived not because its systems worked perfectly, but because, at critical moments, individuals chose restraint over momentum. Because orders were delayed. Because assumptions were questioned. Because someone hesitated when action seemed inevitable. The world did not end, but it very nearly did. And that is the most unsettling part. Because the conditions that brought the world to the edge did not disappear with the missiles. They remained, embedded in doctrines, technologies, and human fallibility. The clock stopped that October, but it has never been dismantled. For 13 days, the fate of the world hung on decisions made in sealed rooms, on grainy photographs, on warnings that arrived just in time or almost too late. History remembers the crisis as resolved, but survival was not guaranteed. It was negotiated. It was improvised. It was accidental. This is not the story of a war. It is the story of how close we came to one and how easily it could happen again.